Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Karl Britto. I'm in the departments of French and Comparative Literature, and I'm currently serving as the Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities at UC Berkeley. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation on authenticity and authorship from the Library of Alexandria to the age of artificial intelligence. I'm grateful for all of you, alumni, supporters, colleagues, and friends of Berkeley for spending a part of your evening with us. And I'm proud to share that the faculty in the Division of Arts and Humanities is among the best in the world. Berkeley is the top public university in the country for arts and humanities, and that's largely due to the excellence of our faculty and the research we produce. I hope tonight to give you a glimpse of the unique and compelling way two faculty members from vastly different fields study and approach a similar topic. Tonight, you're going to be hearing from these two remarkable scholars whose work invites us to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about texts, originality, and what it means to be an author. Rather than asking the familiar question, who wrote this, tonight's discussion will try to ask something more challenging and more revealing. What produced this text? That question feels especially urgent right now. We're living in a moment when artificial intelligence is reshaping how texts are created, circulated, and evaluated. Authorship suddenly seems uncertain. But authorship, like many constructs in our society, was invented. And we're now at a point where computer algorithms are generating new texts, images, and sounds where the concepts of author and authentic may be challenged, deconstructed, and reinvented. Has this happened before? What can we learn from the ancient world that can inform how we approach the future? These are all questions that we'll dig into tonight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Hannes Bajohr is an assistant professor of German at UC Berkeley and a leading scholar of digital literature and contemporary debates around authorship, technology, and textual authenticity. His research explores how digital and automated writing reshapes originality, authorship, and literary value. Hannes is also a practicing poet and novelist working with machine-generated language. Chiayi Li is assistant professor of ancient Greek and Roman studies at UC Berkeley. Her work examines the emergence of ideas about authorship, authenticity, and attribution in the ancient world, particularly in Hellenistic poetry and scholarship in the Library of Alexandria. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We're keeping the audience muted so we don't experience any unnecessary background noise, and we're recording this talk to be able to share it with anyone who couldn't attend tonight. Each speaker will offer a brief presentation of their research, and then we'll open the conversation for Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions as you're listening through the chat, and a member of our staff will help to compile them. So without further ado, Sherry, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carl. And hi to everybody. Thank you all so much for choosing to spend your evening with me and Hannes. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions about authorship and authenticity and all the ways these concepts have shifted from antiquity to the present. Um, can everybody see my PowerPoint? Okay. So I'm going to open our conversation tonight by considering ancient ideas about authorship and authenticity in Greek literature, not in Greece, but in Egypt. And specifically, I want to begin in the city of ancient Alexandria on the western edge of the Nile River Delta during the Hellenistic period, which spans roughly from the 3rd to the 1st centuries BCE. This period marks a profound shift in the political organization of the Mediterranean world, set in motion by the death of the Macedonian general Alexander the Great and the fragmentation of his vast empire into multiple successor kingdoms. And across all of these Hellenistic courts, monarchs invested extraordinary resources in the collection, curation, and study of earlier Greek literature. Poets, scholars, and intellectuals were hosted at royal courts, where they conducted philological research on works like the Odyssey and the Iliad, which many of you may be reading right now for our book club, as well as the classical tragedies. And we also see, crucially, the founding of libraries throughout the Mediterranean, established by both monarchs and elite private individuals. Some inscribed catalogs from these libraries, advertising what their collections contained, have survived, as you can see here, and they give us a glimpse into how people in this period classified and valued Greek literature from earlier periods. One of these Hellenistic kingdoms was based in Egypt and was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, with its capital at Alexandria. I am teaching a seminar on Hellenistic literature this semester at Berkeley, and my students have heard me say repeatedly that ancient Alexandria is, in many ways, just like Berkeley. Both are coastal cities, both are major cultural and intellectual hubs, both have tall, iconic monuments as landmarks, the Campanile versus the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and both are home to world-class libraries that serve as major centers for Greek papyri. Shout out to the Tibtunis Center at Bancroft, which is an incredible resource that I'm very lucky to be able to take advantage of. And importantly, at Alexandria, the Ptolemies founded the Museion, literally a place of the muses, an institution devoted to literary learning, to which the famous Library of Alexandria was attached. And here, scholars copied, edited, analyzed, and cataloged texts such as the Homeric epics and classical tragedies. They wrote commentaries, they studied the Greek language, and crucially developed textual criticism for the first time in Greek literary history, creating philological tools to restore, evaluate, and interpret texts of the past. And central to all of the operations that were taking place at the library was the author's name. If we return to the library catalogs, you can see that they're organized by author. Securely attested authorship, as I observe, appears to have been a fundamental precondition for any text inclusion in a library, and authenticity at this time mattered enormously for the value of a text. One famous, if unreliable, story about the Library of Alexandria describes a kind of arms race among Hellenistic kings to acquire the original works of canonical authors, which allegedly prompted people to slap famous names on texts in order to sell them to the imperial libraries at higher prices. So, according to this version of events, the Library of Alexandria is actually responsible for the birth of literary forgery. Now, whether or not things ever reach that extreme, the broader point holds. The Hellenistic world and literary culture at this time was intensely author-focused. One of the central tasks of Alexandrian scholars was to determine whether texts or parts of texts were genuine or spurious. They produced editions that claimed to present authoritative, authentic versions of canonical works, and their innovations included a system of critical signs designed to mark textual authenticity. One such sign, the obolos, which you can see on surviving papyri, flagged lines in a work that were deemed inauthentic. So within an edited text, these marks expressed varying degrees of scholarly confidence or doubt in the originality of these works. And the scholia, which preserve traces of Hellenistic commentaries, show that scholars approved or excised passages based on whether or not they judged them to be sufficiently Homeric. That is, whether a work was consistent with their assumptions about the authorial intentions and style of Homer and other poets. In other words, the scholars at this time were conducting interpretation, evaluation, and textual judgment that all rested on a concept that we might recognize as the intention of the author. So authorship in the Hellenistic period was not simply a property of a text, it was the starting point for any form of study and interpretation of a work. And the framework of authorship with which the Alexandrian scholars operated was deeply invested in policing authenticity and in protecting the author from spurious intrusion. So, all of what I've just said is one familiar story about Hellenistic Alexandria, the birthplace of textual criticism defined by an intolerance for inauthenticity. But there is another story that challenges this narrative, one that comes from the new poetry being created and composed in this same period, possibly by the very same individuals who were otherwise engaged in producing official editions in the Library of Alexandria. The Hellenistic age witnesses the rapid rise and popularization of a new type of poetry known as epigram, a short poetic form that originated in anonymous inscriptions, epitaphs, and dedications, but that became in this period a fully literary genre on papyrus, and you have examples of both here. As epigram moved onto papyrus, it absorbed features of other genres, including epic and lyric, generating a remarkable abundance of subgenres, such as erotic epigram. And this form of poetry rapidly became a fertile ground for poetic expression throughout the Mediterranean, practiced by Greek-speaking poets hailing from North Africa to southern Italy. A common type of Hellenistic epigram is an epitaph or a dedication commemorating a past author, such as Homer, Plato, or Sappho, the very poets who are being studied in the library and that served as the forebears and models for poets working at this time. But there is a particularly exciting category of epigrams that are actually attributed to such authors. That is, epigrams attributed to Sappho, Plato, even tragedians like Aeschylus. And many of these epigrams survive in the earliest known literary anthology, the Garland, compiled by a poet named Meleager in the first century BCE. And Meleager viewed the poets he collected as an arrangement of flowers, which is the source of our English word, anthology. From a modern scholarly perspective, many, if not all, of these epigrams are inauthentic. The poems belong to subgenres that did not exist in the attributed authors' lifetimes or are attributed to figures who were not known to have written poetry at all. As a result, they are often dismissed as mere forgeries and written off. But I think these epigrams' challenge to authenticity is precisely what makes these poems so culturally interesting at a time when authors' names were a hugely important part of Greek literature. And as we've seen, an attachment to authenticity dominated scholarship at Alexandria. So the big question is, how did this happen? There are several possibilities. A poet might deliberately compose a poem in, say, Sappho's name as a creative exercise. An editor might receive a poem already circulating under her name and include it in an anthology, or an editor might read an unattributed poem and independently assign it to her name. What matters is that these works intervene in an authorial tradition. They play with, respond to, and imaginatively extend the figure of the author. Readers, in turn, could respond in multiple ways, by accepting a poem as genuinely sapphic, or by participating in a literary game of imagining what Sappho might have said. So here are two examples of these epigrams. The one on the left is an epitaph ascribed to Sappho, commemorating a girl who dies just before marriage. This is a theme deeply resonant with Sappho's authentic poetry, where marriage often marks separation and loss for young women. And this poem actually has a very interesting afterlife that I've discovered in a French modernist play about Sappho, which I'd be happy to discuss. And the poem on the right, attributed to Plato, is especially striking. Plato is known as a philosopher of prose dialogue, not a poet, and is absent from his own text as a character. Yet this epigram, composed for Dion of Syracuse, allegedly his student and friend, casts Dion as Plato's lover, imagining an intimacy between two historical figures that might have invited ancient readers to reconsider Plato's works and Plato himself in a different light. This effect is not unlike what we might now call fan fiction, filling in gaps in a canonical work and reimagining canonical figures. Epigram then enables what I think of as a generative culture of authorship, one in which the rules of authenticity can be bent and authors can speak in voices that differ from those established by scholarly authority. So, Hellenistic Alexandria, I think, not only tells us about the invention of ancient authorship concepts that resonate with our own, but also offers us an unusual example of a flourishing culture in which competing models and values of authorship coexist. And I want to end on a brief autobiographical note. Much of the research in this presentation took shape a few years ago during the first major wave of large language models and the rise of ChatGPT, technologies that make it possible to produce text without stable authors, to resurrect voices, and unfortunately, sometimes to cannibalize the styles of living writers. At the same time, these tools have opened up new collaborative and creative possibilities. In the field of classics, predictive language models such as Ithaca and Logion, based on a type of language model known as BERT, have been used to restore fragmentary ancient texts. Other models, including generative ones like ChatGPT, have enabled explicitly dialogic and experimental forms of writing taken up by authors such as Vauhini Vara. As I see it, Hellenistic approaches to authorship resonate strongly with these contemporary developments. We see how new textual cultures and technologies precipitate new ways of writing and new ways of imagining what it means to write at all. In pursuing this research, I find myself asking questions that probably many of you are asking now. What role does textual technology play in shaping concepts of authorship? How do ideas about authorship prompt or even anticipate radical changes in our textual culture? And as we grapple with these challenges today, I hope and believe that the Hellenistic period offers us a thought-provoking ancient precedent, a symbiotic literary environment in which the authentic and the inauthentic could coexist. And I'm going to hand things off to Hannes to tell us more about those modern possibilities. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Sherry, for this fantastic presentation. I will try to share my screen now, and I hope you will see um, my presentation. I want to thank you, first of all, for coming. I'm glad to share my work um, with the Berkeley alumni. My name is Hannes Bajohr. I'm an assistant professor in the German department here at Berkeley. And as Karl said, my work mostly focuses on AI and literature, especially the long tradition of rule-based and procedural writing. And like Sherry, I'm interested in the construction of the idea of the singular author. And as she has just shown, authorship has often been unstable, especially in antiquity, where texts are frequently attributed after the fact. But of course, these uncertainties persist into modernity, and they return with new urgency in the age of AI. Questions like, will AI replace human authors, that are often asked, may therefore miss the point, since what an author is changes with time. And in this talk, I want to address these issues in 4 steps. First, I will sketch 2 modern genealogies of authorship, one that begins with Romanticism and that sees the author as a genius, and an alternative one that reaches back to the Baroque that sees the author more as a logician. Second, I will show how these genealogies feed directly into the earliest attempts to produce literature with computers. And then I will discuss 2 new models of authorship that emerge in the age of AI. Finally, I'll turn to the question of attribution again. I call this the post-artificial condition. What changes when we are no longer certain not only who wrote a text, but also what wrote it? The first model of authorship I want to discuss emerges in the late 18th century and still shapes our thinking today. That is, the author as genius. In the Critique of Judgment of 1790, Immanuel Kant defines genius as, quote, a talent for producing that for which no determinate rule can be given, not a predisposition or skill of that which can be learned in accordance with some rule. This yields a specific image of authorship. First, the genius appears as an exceptional, perhaps even divinely gifted individual to the degree that their talent cannot be fully explained or taught. Works may be imitated, but genius itself remains inimitable. Second, the author is imagined as solitary, creating an isolation from the world. Romantic thinkers such as Shelley intensify this model by linking writing to the expression of some kind of inner self. Authorship becomes then the outward form of something uniquely personal. But this is only one way of thinking about authorship. If we go back only about 100 years to the Baroque period, we find a very different idea, the author as a logician. creation is now understood as something methodical. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz plays a central role here. He thought that rationality is a type of calculation with symbols. Quote, all our thinking is nothing but the connection or substitution of signs, whether these are words or marks or images. What is more, for Leibniz, language can directly express reality. It follows that systematically combining words should systematically produce true statements about the world. This idea was taken up by German Baroque poets who tried to systematically produce poetry. We now call this combinatorial poetry. They treated words as elements of thought, rearrangeable according to rules. One example is the German poet Georg Philipp Harsdorff, who gives us the following poem. Honor, art, money, goods, praise, wife and child, one has, seeks, lacks, hopes for, and it disappears. And I assure you it rhymes in German and is a little less awkward. Rearranging all the marked elements of these lines in all possible combination yields about 3,628,000 unique and metrically correct poems. It is, in other words, a machine for producing poetry. As you can see, this is a very different model of authorship. It's not the romantic genius who doesn't follow rules but sets them and who works alone, divinely inspired. Instead, what we have here is often called the poeta calculans, the calculating poet, who uses a method that, in principle, can be learned and taught. And there is no reason why these methods should not be explored collectively, as Harsdorff and his group did. These two ideas of authorship now collide in the computer. With computer pioneer Alan Turing writing about artificial intelligence in 1950, he treated writing a sonnet at that time still as something paradigmatic, challenging for machines. Yet on the other hand, more broadly, he argued that a digital computer could, in principle, perform any rule-governed activity. So whether an AI can be an author depends on what model of authorship we assume. But Turing was not alone. Mid-century, already outside of early AI, we can see that the idea of algorithmic poetry comes back into fashion and shapes experimental literature, even if it is entirely analog. French poet Raymond Queneau's 100,000 billion poems from 1961 opens with a line attributed to Alan Turing. A poem written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. And in a way, Queneau's book is exactly that, a paper machine. It contains a sonnet in which each line can be replaced by 25 alternatives. By simply flipping the strips of paper, the reader generates the enormous number of sonnets announced in the title. You can see a demonstration here. However, the earliest known example of actual computer poetry predates Queneau. A colleague of Turing's at Manchester University, Christopher Strachey, wrote a program in 1952 already that selects nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs at random to produce love letters. You can see the template and the example of the output. So from a structure like my adjective, noun, adverb, verb, your adjective, noun, the program then creates my curious enchantment devotedly yearns for your ambition. And the letter is even signed with MUC, Manchester University Computer. It ran at night, and the next morning, users of the mainframe would find a love letter waiting for them, attributed to the machine itself. However, what's important is that Strachey was clear that he was the author of the program and thus, albeit indirectly, also of its output. What Strachey and others early computer poetry have in common is that they rely on the machine's capacity to automate rule following. As a result, the process remains transparent in principle. Authors know how the system is built, and readers can reconstruct the procedure by examining enough outputs. Now, with modern machine learning, what is now often called AI, things become more difficult. Large language models like the GPT systems underlying ChatGPT are no longer rule-based in the same way. They are statistical systems. Instead of following handwritten compositional instructions, they predict the most likely next word based on training across vast quantities of text. And because no one programs their specific choices directly, it's often difficult to explain why a model produces this output rather than that one. They became opaque. There are already many literary experiments with these systems. One of the early cases is K. Alana McDowell's Pharmaco-AI from 2020, written at the time still with GPT-3, a predecessor of ChatGPT. McDowell describes the process as a type of co-writing, a text emerging through an ongoing exchange between human and model. This practice also reshapes the idea of authorship. Soon after ChatGPT's release, the Canadian author Stephen Marsh produced a murder mystery with a language model aptly titled The Death of an Author. Having every single sentence written by the machine, though prompted by Marsh, he did not publish it under his name. Instead, the book appeared under the pseudonym Iden Machine, a name apparently suggested by the model itself. In early computer writing, the model of authorship often looks like the poeta calculans, the calculating poet, mechanized. With modern AI, it might be tempting to claim the opposite, the return of the romantic genius, a black box whose inner rules are unknowable. But before adapting such a view, two things need to be clarified. First, what is the role of the human in relation to the machine and the output? That role still matters, at least for now. It seems unlikely that anyone truly treats Iden Machine as the author of Marsh's novel, rather than as an authorship fiction, and that is not so different from the Manchester University computer. And second, we need to be precise about technology involved. The difference between early computer writing and modern AI is not just a matter of degree, but rather of kind. And to make this clearer, we can draw a typology, which I call causal authorship. It measures the distance between the human and textual output and the steps between. Already here we see important differences. What I call primary authorship is the standard model of writing. An author more or less directly puts words onto paper or onto a data carrier. Shelley wrote this way, and most of us still do, even when we use a word processor. Secondary authorship introduces a first-order distance. Here, the author does not write the text directly, but writes the rules that will generate the text. This already applies to analog combinatorial poetry from Harsdorfer to Queneau. It also applies to early digital experiments like Strachey's love letter program. With machine learning, however, something new appears, which I call tertiary authorship. Now, the human no longer writes the rules directly. Instead, I train the model on a data set that is a large quantity of text, and only after the system has learned statistical regularities encoded in what are called model weights does it produce an output. The distance increases once again. And finally, because most of us don't train our own models, we might even speak of a type of quaternary authorship. With systems like ChatGPT, users cannot choose the dataset or alter the training process. They work with, as it were, factory settings. In this model, the primary human contribution is reduced to a single thing, the prompt, namely write a poem. Alana McDowell and Marsh both use proprietary systems, so they might be quaternary authors more than tertiary ones. Even though this typology still places the human at the beginning of the chain. After all, someone must always initiate the process, even if at a distance. But we might also say that this is not the whole story. After all, no one really writes alone. So we're going to introduce a second model that counters the first. I call this distributed authorship. It understands authorship as a sprawling network of the people and structures involved in the final product. The author is now severely sidelined. Other factors become more visible. The language model is already trained on text produced by countless writers. They are part of the network. So is the code written by many engineers, and the underlying ideas of the code are mathematical formulas before they are articulated in programming language. They have authors. What is more, the existence of the whole network depends on economic, legal, and institutional structures. All, in a way, have part in authorship, thus understood. And if we take labor and material seriously, authorship extends even further to the workers who extract the rare earths that are used in computation. We can even include these materials themselves, so that in the end, the earth itself merely claim to be part of that authorship network. Of course, we need not go that far, but even without such radical expansion, one conclusion is unavoidable. Wherever we draw the boundary, authorship is not singular. And that means even with opaque AI models, we cannot return to the isolated figure of the romantic genius. So far, I've mostly described authorship from the perspective of production, but both models explain how text comes into being, either through distance or through entanglement with other actors. But there's also another side, the perspective of reception. And this is probably the one that we think about most today. After all, we do not treat texts neutrally. We read them differently depending on who we believe they wrote them. And here the impact of AI is much deeper. When the question, was this written by a human or a machine, becomes harder to answer, authorship itself comes under stress. This is not primarily about truth. Writers can deceive, and literature can plausibly be described as an author lying to its audience. The issue is not about truth, but about origin. And origin in an anthropological sense, not did this or that person write the text, but does this text have a human author at all? The question shifts from who wrote this to what wrote this. This is what I call the post-artificial condition. It names a situation in which we can no longer be certain whether a text is human-written or machine-produced. And the post-artificial condition, as I see it, has three consequences. First, for the first time since the Romantics, that is, since the author became the presumed source of expression and meaning, we recognize that we had a standard expectation that texts are written by humans. This expectation only becomes visible once an alternative appears. Second, because there is an alternative, this standard expectation is now increasingly replaced by a creeping doubt. Every text, every utterance may now be partially or fully machine-generated. We see this in our work as teachers when we read student essays, but we also see it in a broader cultural practice that we might call folk forensics, that is, the collective attempt to identify the markers of machine writing. On Reddit, for example, there's a group called Is This AI? And it does exactly this. It looks for telltale signs, the ChatGPT M-dash, the not this but that sentence structure, the smoothness of generic phrasing overall. And of course, this matters far beyond literature. Here's a screenshot of a Reddit user asking whether their partner generated an apology. The assumption is an apology only means something if you actually wrote it, if it is authentic. In other words, if a who and not a what produced it. Finally, we can ask whether the state of permanent uncertainty is sustainable. If there is no technical fix to this, and so far AI text cannot reliably be detected, then we may be moving towards something like a second stage of the post-artificial condition, a stage in which origins begin to recede. The question of what or who wrote the text steps into the background. Authorship then may become agnostic, and other questions more important. So, what does the text say? How is it written? How does it circulate? What response does it provoke? What actions does it enable? Of course, this remains speculative, and it would likely apply to some kind of text more than others. Literature, for instance, probably depends on authorship more than, say, an informational brochure does. But something does change. And it might not be a return to Alexandria, though pseudoepigraphy that Sherry talked about might be a possible side effect. But it certainly is also not the romantic genius. So to me, at least, it seems less likely that AI replaces human authors. Rather, under post-artificial conditions, authorship itself may lose its central role for reading. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for to both of you for this incredibly interesting presentation of your research, and it's really striking to me how timely your research is, and that's addressed to both of you, timely and untimely, perhaps. I think I'd like to open out the conversation now and invite our audience to put the questions in the chat that they've been thinking about. And I have a few that have been assembled for me. I think I'll start with a question for Sherry, which has to do with, there are actually a number of questions coming in around the question of attribution, right? And so, you showed that slide, that really interesting kind of library catalog slide where you have all of these texts that are attributed to particular authors. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more generally about the question of attribution in the ancient world, right? So is the Library of Alexandria, one of many sites where this is happening at a particular moment? How are they thinking about things like fragments of ancient works that they may have they're engaged in a process of trying to come up with an attribution, but that attribution is contested. There's another kind of question about the attribution of text to fictional author figures that is actually addressed to both of you, and it's something that I was kind of thinking about in relationship, Hannes, to your division of, your description of this post that we're living through, right, where we can no longer determine human or machine authorship. But of course, historically, there's a whole category of texts, for example, that tend to be attributed to divine authorship, right? So it's a human who is transcribing the text, but the text is actually coming from something that's not human. Sorry, I'm already spelling out with the questions because you've generated so much thought, but I'll start with Sherry around that question of attribution.
Yeah, that's such a rich question. And on a non-textual level, before the Hellenistic period, we see forms of composition, especially poetic composition, that are very clearly non-authorial. Like that is, they're not playing into the idea of a single author, a single autonomous author, even if these aren't phenomena that we can very clearly identify and attribute. It's likely that given the cultures, especially of oral production and transmission, there are multiple people involved in the creation of something that we now receive as a physical text. There are different, the models that Hannes talked about, distributed authorship, collective authorship. In fact, people are trying to see if those are frameworks that are applicable to describe especially oral production and transmission before the Hellenistic period. And certainly these are phenomena that we could designate this way during that period. But what does attribution look like on a text? I think I saw this question in the chat. So on a papyrus roll, you before, say, like, some if other forms of attribution in the second century CE, the papyri that are coming into institutions like the Library of Alexandria do have the author's name written on the outside edge. It's called the temple of the temple of the roll. That's where you would find the author's name. And later on in the imperial period, you sometimes get actually separate tags that would be placed on the papyrus roll as a label. So whether they were, sharing a surface with the papyrus or some other label, there were ways of designating the author's name. And epigrams aren't the only things getting anthologized in this period. We have lots of examples of actually excerpts of Homer being put together with excerpts of Euripides and epigrams all thrown in together, and they all have the author's name. So we have evidence for this phenomenon, but we might think of institutions like the Library of Alexandria and these other elite libraries I mentioned as major, attribution granting institutions where their role is to very authoritatively state and confirm and verify that a body of scholars, a body of people working on these texts have read it, studied it, and they're choosing to put very authoritatively the name of the author on this edition. But of course, what I find interesting is that there are opportunities for ghostwriting and attributing things to famous authors in antiquity. Homer, of course, is a very classic example, and that's why this creates so much of an issue for the scholars working on texts of Homer in the Hellenistic period. But I find it fascinating that this is emerging as a culture of fake pseudepigraphic text at the same time that they're really defining what it means for an attribution to be something that bears authenticity, something that bears the weight of a confirmed image of an author. And I think that resonates with some of the things Hannes was pointing to as well.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Hannes. I don't know if you want to add
I
some
wanted
thoughts.
to talk about the attribution to divinity. I think that's a really interesting point, and that's why I say, I don't want to go further back than 250 years or something to the Romantics a little earlier, because obviously there is a long history of these attributions to non-humans. What's interesting about this for me is that we come back to some kind of philosophical anthropology here, right? What is the other of the human? And for the longest time, it is the divine. It is the angels, all the animals. But only recently it has become the machine, and we can see this also in that history of authorship, what I call the standard expectation. So I say that maybe the last 200 years are the most important ones here. In the German context, what is called the Goethe-Zeit, the time of Goethe, is very important for the development of authorship because it is tied to copyright. Right? It's tied to the idea that famous authors, popular authors like Goethe, would not be able to profit from their own writing because so much inauthentic prints would circulate. So we already have the idea of authorship, commodity that circulates and that someone needs to be recompensed for.
Yeah, yeah. I was partly inspired in the question about like the divine
Mhm.
by an article that I saw recently that was about how readily people ascribe divine characteristics to the speech that they receive from ChatGPT and other kinds of AI sources. I mean, it's interesting to think about like people who approach ChatGPT as if it were a divine oracle in a sense, right? To ask a question and then to receive a certain kind of response that is
Yeah.
precisely not human. Um, I was interested, Sherry, also in your presentation. You talked a little bit about the investment, just the financial investment in the establishment of these centers, right? Like the Library of Alexandria and the extent to which for royal courts, right, this was a very important um, aspect of cultural work. And you talked also about the value associated with the manuscript that had a clear right ascription to an author. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that aspect of value, right? And why did rulers care about having clearly attributed manuscripts in the or papyri in the library?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting facet of the mythology that I think surrounds the Library of Alexandria and also imperial libraries at this time. I do want to be very clear that very little materially survives from the Library of Alexandria. You saw the single stone that was in the PowerPoint, and that is really, even that is potentially dubious. But something that seems to be fairly consistent in all narratives about imperial powers, and we can see this in narratives about Rome, about Babylonian libraries, not just the Hellenistic libraries, is that changes in regime or ways of staking imperial identity are tied often to stories about the capture and migration and uprooting of important library collections. And this is a very, very familiar trope. We see that in the Library of Alexandria sort of myth world, it acquires this extra dimension of them being downstream of the important Greek literature that they're studying that they're editing, and it's tied up with a need, a very, very diffuse need to demonstrate cultural superiority, cultural importance through Greek literature that was considered to be extremely culturally important. And it's a form of imperial identity making. So I think together with the really interesting stories that get told about the financial cost of assembling these libraries and staffing the people who studied them and edited them, I think is a sort of broader, like a murkier but very ideologically important story about establishing Greekness as an identity, about positioning themselves in a position of historical importance after the classical period. We're in Alexandria and not Athens anymore. And the kind of physical situation of Greek literature in Alexandria is an important part of the story that the Ptolemies tell, as well as the other Hellenistic kingdoms.
Thank you so much. I have a question that comes from the chat for Hannes and links back to the point that you just made about, the period of Goethe corresponding to the period in which the legal concept of copyright really comes into its modern form. There's an interesting question in the chat that essentially makes the point that modern copyright is sort of allergic, is the way the person put it, right? Allergic to the kinds of distributed authorship, right? Networked authorship that you talked about in your presentation. So I guess the question that's being asked is if historically speaking, authorship emerged from this pattern of circulation, attribution, and reuse, what do we make of a system where AI outputs? So the output is not proprietary, but the models that generate them are owned, right? So,
Yeah.
does that suggest a return to the way that the person put the question is, does this suggest a return to pre-modern authorship under modern legal constraints, or is this something completely new that we're that we're facing?
I think it's always a good question to ask what is the same, what are the what's the archaeology of the current moment, but also what is different. And I think here I find it interesting that there are a couple of differences that arise. I mean, the one thing is we have somewhat connected to the idea of the singular author and the idea to copyright some slightly different ontology of personhood than before, right? If the author is now kind of identifiable also as a legal subject with profit interests, that is a different idea of authorship than one in which we simply attribute something to the author as some kind of idea rather than a person with rights. The danger I see in saying that we're returning to this is that it makes maybe a case for the arguments of AI companies that it's okay to kind of suck up all that text that has been written by individual authors and kind of put it to this machine. We can also say one of the differences is authorship not only is a question of profit and income, but also of responsibility. There's an easy way to say that because a machine itself is part of a network of actors, that no one is responsible for whatever it does in the real world. I think that is a danger that would arise from too quickly transferring that model of the network back into what we have now. That's why I think those two different models are probably not a bad idea to check each other. And the other thing is, well, what makes money with these models? It's not the output, it's the capacity for output, right? It's the conversion of a data set into a potentiality of other texts, not in those texts themselves. And I think that is kind of a shift of in the economy of the textual economy that we see with these models. And I think that requires probably quite different concepts to describe.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. I had another question from the chat here that is addressed to both of you. And it has to do, if I understand it correctly, it has to do with the question of attribution in relation to a specific subset of texts, which are texts that present themselves as historical accounts. So, when you think of examples of texts that have been understood to be historical, which involves, a whole set of assumptions about their relationship to the world and the truth claims of their statements, there are cases in which such texts have been revealed to be forgeries or different kinds of hoaxes, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a way that we can think about the kind of attribution of the writing subject in that context that helps us think about the ramifications of the questions that you're both thinking through? the stakes. I mean, you both talked about the 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 sort of discomfort of that moment of realizing that you had an investment in a certain kind of attribution, right? And a certain kind of figure of an author. Um,
Yeah.
are
I
the
mean,
stakes
yeah.
intensified in the context of historical narratives, or is it more or less? I mean, the line between the literary and the historical is not absolute, of course, right?
Sherry, you want to go first?
Yeah. Um, this is a really, really, so many examples popped up into my head, some of them very, very recent, because of course, what's interesting about, the kind of discomfort that you mentioned, which I feel is a very modern response, and that one that I'm wary of retrojecting very easily onto the past. I think something that I'm trying to make room for in the project is the possibility that even though they're operating with concepts of authenticity that might seem very familiar, there's nevertheless the possibility that readers could have known that potentially this attribution to Sappho or Plato is not 100% authentic and still manage to derive pleasure from the text. And I take as actually a given the fact that these texts under pseudepigraphic or inauthentic names, the fact that they come down to us as fact that people nevertheless derive pleasure from them. And there's so many examples of this. I focused just on epigram here because it's a very extreme case. It's an edge case for me of texts that are so far outside of the canonical author's main corpora that they really push us to think about the limits of credence, the limits of pleasure in the face of something that is potentially false. But of course, there are so many examples in ancient literature. There are, pseudo-Platonic dialogues. There are pseudepigraphic orations. And I think, of course, with something that presents itself as a historical account, I think there it's just very simply the idea that they're lying about the knowledge that is contained in the text, that it's no longer knowledge bearing in the same way. Um, but I think a sort of more interesting dynamic is when, a text is not explicitly knowledge bearing in that way or claiming to provide historical information, but just the fact of the author potentially not being who they are. They're potentially being a community, several individuals who are nameless and faceless and unknown to the reader, what that does or doesn't do to their experience of that text. And sometimes it's the very fact of that author being invented or a pseudonym that actually gives context to the work. This text doesn't, it only makes sense if you read it as belonging to that author, and that's where the pleasure is. So yeah,
Hmm.
I hope that answers that.
Thanks. Yeah, Hannes, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I just wonder, I mean, this is it would be interesting to classify the kind of sudden revelation of authorship that one was expecting to be someone else. I can think of a couple of examples. I mean, the famous one obviously is Ossian, who was thought to be a text from a Gaelic bard from the third century, were forgeries, and they are, for instance, are very important in Goethe's Werther. They still don't know that Ossian is fake, and they really
Mm.
keep citing him. So here, the sudden revelation would be one about history, historical accuracy, maybe also the idea what is assumed. And I think we can read these sudden revelations as indicative of certain expectations and certain assumptions. And I think there they become analytically interesting. Another example would be the fake memories or the memories, the biographies of fake Holocaust survivors, right? I'm thinking of
Mm.
Benjamin Volkomirsky. What do we learn from that sudden revelation about the assumptions of that we have towards authenticity, but also about witnessing, about survivorship, etc. And then finally, the most recent phenomenon would be the sudden revelation that something we thought was human produced was produced by a computer, especially in art, especially in literature a little bit, but I think more so in the visual arts. There were a couple of cases where an artwork won a prize that was then later revealed to be done by an AI. And I think for me that's interesting because it says something about this standard expectation that I was talking about, but also about the shifting assumption what humans can do and cannot, right? If an AI produces something we can experience as a valuable artwork, and we learn that it's not, then maybe we have to rethink our understanding of art, but also the kind of humanist assumptions behind it. So I think as an analytic category, this is actually very, very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. That gives us a lot to think about because I think those cases that you're noting, and there are so many of them where a text is in a very intense way about a certain form of personal experience, personal historical experience, lived experience, and then is revealed actually to have been produced by someone who does not actually have that experience, right? And I think that gap is one that is often shocking. And then to think about it taking the further leap out of the human entirely, right? At what point are generative AI models going to be, well, I guess they already are, claiming certain forms of experience that we don't associate with machines, right? There's a question in the chat about this is sort of another potentially unnerving aspect of generative AI models, which is you can now ask ChatGPT, for example, to write in the style of particular individuals, right? As long as they have like a large enough textual footprint that's been vacuumed up by the model, there's a kind of stylistic aspect to the writing that the model will pick up on and then attempt to reproduce. So there was a question in the chat that I'm just going to read and allow you to interpret as you will. Does that, would you say that aspect of what these models can now do point to the text itself as containing traces of a generating function, which is, I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's sort of putting pressure on our sense, again, going back to sort of the romantic figure of the genius, right? That there is something original about anything that we say or write ever, right? Do you feel that AI is really fundamentally challenging like something that we think of as so fundamental to human expression, that aspect of creativity that is often understood as originality, but may not be that?
I think it lays bare a lot of our assumptions about this. And I know that structuralists are having a field day with AI, right? The idea that the symbolic order is autonomous and that everything is intertext and everything is kind of basically the repetition and variation of cliches is something that we could really use for the description of AI. Style itself as something generative, I think, falls in that way of understanding semiotics. What I find interesting here is to what degree is it style, right? What definition of style can we use for describing what's happening when AI or ChatGPT writes in the style of? Because we don't really have vocabulary for that, not in stylometrics, which is still relatively underdeveloped in the humanities, but also in linguistics itself. Style is very often understood as making a meaningful choice between alternatives to say the same thing. And that meaningful choice assumes the existence of some kind of intent. So exactly what's at issue in AI, right? Do we have to, if we use that that concept of style, attribute intent and intentionality to AI systems, which is a very strong philosophical position, right? or is what we're seeing something that needs to be described in other terms? And in the end, will something like a collectivization of style will occur? Style will not become the marker of an individual author, but something that is freely available to us to use, like clothes we can change. And the third option is, will that make style less important, or will it push specifically literature in directions that may be more avant-garde, right? This is a return, is it the vengeance of the avant-garde in a way, if certain ways of writing become mainstreamed and available to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that we have to cut off the discussion here because we're just about out of time. Thank you again. And thanks to all of the people who put questions in the chat. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but it's been such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. So I thank both Hannes and Sherry for showing us how this set of questions around authorship, whether in ancient Alexandria or in the contemporary age of AI, can really help us to engage more thoughtfully with our own reading and writing practices and the assumptions that we bring to them. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us and for, again, all of your thoughtful questions. We'll be sending out an email soon soliciting feedback on future lecture topics, but also with a link to our Fund for Faculty in the Arts and Humanities. It's a fund that is really one of the best tools we have to keep our great professors here and to ensure their work is supported. So I ask if you're able that you might consider making a donation to the Fund for Faculty and help the Arts and Humanities remain strong and supported in this difficult climate. Our next and final virtual lecture of the academic year will be on May 14th and will feature Jim Porter and Mario Tello in a conversation entitled The Unclassical Homer, which sounds like a great topic following on from some of the things that we were talking about today. Email invitations for that event will be sent out in early spring. So thank you again for being with us tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you again soon.